Hi, everyone. Welcome to my podcast, Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess. And today we are going to be talking with Stephanie Keeney Parks. I am so excited to talk to you, Stephanie, because this is such an important topic we're going to be covering. I'm quickly going to read your bio, which is amazing, just a short version of it. And people can find out more about you in our show notes. But Stephanie Keeney Parks' research centers on the everyday lives of Black parents who have children with autism. She's also interested in the process of diagnosing a Black child with autism, as well as the healthcare disparities that these families face. Stephanie is interested in centering the Black parent's narrative and experience as the expert to decenter white ideologies on health, healthcare, disability, and Black culture. Her research stems from her experience as a Black woman, wife, and mother of 2 children. Stephanie's oldest child is diagnosed with autism. Welcome, Stephanie. This is such an important discussion, and thank you so much for agreeing to come on my podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's a very important discussion. Well, can we start by just asking you to explain your research? That's quite a big, you're covering a super huge topic, and I know you're busy with your doctorate at the moment, so I'd love to hear more about your research.
Right. So my master's research, the impetus for it all is really my experience being a mother of a child with autism and kind of navigating all the services that are kind of part and parcel of that through the education system and the medical system. And then how did we, incorporate that into a family structure of African Americans who may or may not be kind of amenable to the diagnostic label or the healthcare necessary or that my husband and I felt was necessary for our son or, right? Like, how do we kind of make this thing kind of work together? And that's where it stems from. And so in my master's research, I spent time watching clinicians work with families and doing some diagnosing of children. I did not do the diagnosing. I watched other folks do the diagnosing of children with autism, especially Black children with autism. And then I worked with a cohort of 20-some Black families that were all middle and upper middle class to try and understand better, like, how we kind of think about this topic and what do we think is salient and important to us. And then my dissertation research, again, just builds upon that.
Oh, wow. Well, that's a broad overview. So let's dive into some of the details, because just in the little bit of the intro I did on your background, you tackling autism was already one of those subjects that has had so many definitions over the years. I started practicing I've been in this field 38 years, and 38 years ago when we were talking about autism, it's changed so much now. And I worked in schools for autism and that kind of thing, and it's just so different. And I almost feel, I don't know, you really in the thick of it. But I almost feel that the way that we define it now is not even, it was better before. There seemed to be more of an open-minded approach to recognizing and understanding the different facets before. And it's become very almost siloed. And I could be wrong, I don't know, but that's just my impression. So I'd love to know more from you. What have you found from your research? And then there's the whole issue of the Black disparity and in general in healthcare. So that's a big loaded question. So how would you like to dive? What would you like to dive in first? What are you most comfortable?
It's important to note that I'm an anthropologist, right? So anthropology, we study humans and the human experience in a super broad way. And so that means for me that when I work with a family, I get to talk about and participate in their everyday world. What does it look like for a family who's got their autistic kid at swimming lessons today? And what is mom talking about while we're sitting in the bleachers watching our kids take lessons, right? And what does it look like when she's trying to transition that child back to the car? Or what are the stories that are happening in their world and their everyday life? And because we pay such nice attention to people's everyday life worlds, we can get a sense of bigger things too, right? There's so much data on what you said, you explained the major healthcare deficits that Black families face. We know we're twice as likely to be missed or undiagnosed, right? Sure, but what does that look like to my family? What did that look like when my son went through it or any other parent's child went through it? And that's kind of how the research gets so broad, is because we center it on the everyday family, and then it kind of just proliferates out, because that if you have a child with a disability doesn't just happen in the home. It happens at school and at church and at swimming lessons and the grocery store, and it's all the time and everywhere. And because so many systems kind of they just intersect to try and care for these children and these families, then you get access to a lot of things like the diagnostic process or speech pathology or social skills classes, and then how that also takes place in school spaces as well. And that's why it can sound so broad. Does that help a little bit contextualize?
Yes, I'm so glad that anthropology, and I love that you explained that. Thank you for stepping in and explaining that, because what's so vital here is to recognize it's not just about the individual, it's about the individual in the environment. And we really are in a medical model, disease model, where everything is about the individual. Meanwhile, the environment's massive. It's huge. It's nature, nurture plus the I factor. So yeah, I'm so glad that the anthropological approach is a vital component. So thank you for explaining that. It's really, yeah, we have to. You can't just isolate. And we've become like that. I don't know if you feel that as well over the last, sort of 30, 40 years. It's become very much about the brain, about the individual, about the physical. Whereas you are saying, let's look at the environment because it impacts. It's not about you. It's about you in the environment. And it's massive.
Yeah. Yes. And it can be so different, right? Like you can take people of different socioeconomic levels in the same exact environment and have totally different impacts. And I mean, you have to talk about the minutia of a person's experience to try and understand the bigger numbers as well, and you can say a lot of things, right? Like we have all these massive health disparities, but then how do they really function in the everyday world of our families? And then we can maybe start to handle some of those, which would be the goal, right? Like we don't just do this work because it's not super fun to just, sit in your books all day and think about health disparities, but it is vital work to make sure that, all families across this nation and across the world, for that matter, have access to healthcare that they find salient and useful for their families, right? And so this is my particular entrance as an autism parent, right, to try and make the world a better space for my child and my daughter will inherit her brother's care.
So what you're saying is to make the systemic changes that are requires looking at the individual within their family and then the impact and then translating that up and into the greater. So it's got to start. So you've got to have that approach and understanding it. Okay, so what have you found in your research? And there's so many areas that we could go into. So, I mean, like, what really got you into researching this topic? Let's start with that. And then let's maybe define the sort of areas, what you've been looking at specifically and what you've actually found and how your research is going to contribute to society. So let's start with what got you into this.
So what really happened is I am a mom of a child with autism, and I use his particular language surrounding autism. So when you hear me say he's autistic and I don't use like particular people first language, it's because my child doesn't. And I go with his identification of how he sees his autism. And you literally call it his autism. So just to give you some language context, I came to the work because our family was experiencing health disparities and difficulties navigating schools. And we weren't the only family. This is like a really kind of typical experience within autism, like through socioeconomic, it's like cross-cultural, it's cross-class. It's, of course, the more education, more money you have, the easier the experience is in this way, but they're still fighting. It just gets more and more difficult, right, as certain things kind of layer on top. Are you a person of color? Are you a woman? Do you have an education? What type of education? How high is your education? Where are you located in this country? Are you in this country? Do you have insurance? Right? Like, so all these things started to compound. And I'm a mom who's maybe not, I have girlfriends who can do things like they run these fabulous big advocacy organizations, or they can like do the, autism sensory friendly parties for the kids in the neighborhood and whatnot. I'm not that type of mom. I'm a mom who has a skill set at reading. I like to read. I like to do research. I'm pretty good at academia. So this is my particular intervention. And so I just started by talking to parents that I knew. And I also knew that for my family, the translation of my child having autism, like where we were located, my husband was Air Force when my child was diagnosed. Where we were located, we were very far from our family, who's from a rural area. And our family doesn't necessarily use the category autism with my son, but it's his very, very best place in the whole world. If he wants to be social and happy and a part of everything, which he's a super social, happy guy, he loves to go home to our bigger family structure, right? But they don't say Del has autism. And so I started to get interested in like, why was this tension happening and why were they so good at care for him, right? And starting to answer that question. I went back to school while sitting in a waiting room because that's where my kid was getting services, and finished my degree online, and then had more questions. And I got myself into a master's degree program. And then I completed a research project with Black families that have kids with autism there, and continued on to my PhD at UCLA. So, and throughout this, like, what I keep finding is more questions, which is really problematic.
That's what research does.
I know, it's terrifying. I was like, if I just keep going, I'll answer something. And that is not true. What I can tell you, though, is that what really scared me was that because I worked with families who were middle and upper middle class, they had all of these kind of classic respectability markers that Black families in the US particularly are taught, like if you're a two-parent married household, if you go on to get your graduate degrees, if you have money and access to insurance, right? Like you do all these things, you'll be equitable and get access to the American pie. And it proved to be not true. And it was unnerving to watch parents work so hard, right? To meet all these kind of markers and still see them suffer in this disparity, right? And that for me was just
unacceptable.
Yeah. And my family's part of it too. Like my story fits that narrative too, right? Like, and that was really, really hard for me to accept and then leave alone, right? Like once I knew that was the case, then what was the next step to kind of continue thinking through what's happening to these families and maybe why, right? And how can we kind of intervene into that space? And, you know, just kind of like flipping narratives on their head. Like there's always a common narrative that there's kind of cultural mistrust around medicine. And while that's kind of true, it's only kind of true. So, you know what I mean? Like trying to like kind of like make interventions into some of these type of stereotypes that are happening. Like, yeah, I will tell you that my family doesn't do like the autism label very well. They don't like it. They just don't find it useful, but it doesn't mean that they don't see that Del has a disability or needs supports or how to provide those supports, right? It does mean that we have 400 years of data showing Black families that they have to be protective of ourselves to make sure we survive. And so, you know what I mean?
There's a
like,
reason why, yeah.
There's much more tension surrounding this than we kind of give space for. We need to be much more nuanced with it. So, I mean, like
Sorry to interrupt you. Is it almost like a fear of the label with the 400 years of disparity, or is it just that the label is, what is the reason?
To me, from the sense that I've gotten from a lot of folks is that it's just unimportant, and it feels like almost like a translation, right? Like if I'm translating, it means the label is not created for us by us, right? And it's not something that maybe we find important or necessary, but we'll engage with that label if we have to do things like, say, like you often label your kid with whatever disability because you need the supports in school. Or you'll need the medical insurance access. And to get access to medical insurance, you have to have a particular label, right? But in the home, do you need that label to make sure that they're loved and cared for and part of your family? You know, it's just a different, and I think we have to give like a ton of space for people to engage in different cultures, even when it looks like it's similar, right? So you'd say, oh, well, we're all American, right? But we're Black American. And that's just enough different that we have to provide space for the ways in which we're experiencing and thinking through these processes, right? And especially language. Like language is a huge one. So, you know, yeah, and that's another thing that came through my research was language. Like the way we talk about disability, the ideologies that we think through, like what do these labels mean to these different families, or what do they mean to clinicians when they diagnose them, right? Like, so language showed up in a way that I also was unprepared for, really, to be honest at first. And then again, during my PhD, I've attacked that.
I love that. And I'd love you to dive into that more, because language is such a tool, but language can destroy and it can build at the same time. And so I'm really glad you've raised that. Would you mind just diving into that a little bit more?
Absolutely. So, I mean, like language is so fraught. It's so fraught, right? Like, and we think that we're just communicating. But think about like silly things like, oh, in California, they don't call it pop, they call it soda. right? And people like get into arguments about this. I mean, over pop and soda. So can you imagine like how that must feel for bigger conversations, right? Like terrifying. And language is also tied to processes of racialization here in the US, especially. And so, for example, people often identify Black language in particular as being slang or ghetto or not appropriate or not academic, etc. But we know from the work of linguistic anthropologists in particular and linguists in general that it's a really complicated, beautiful, rich language source, and we need to encounter it as such, right? But if you go into a clinic and watch somebody diagnose autism, and they're not kind of with that kind of idea about Black
I
language,
just see it going all wrong.
Yeah, and it's not like a clinician shows up today and says, I'm going to do something so racist to add to the health disparity, right? Like, that's not the way this works. What's so scary about racism in these clinical spaces is that they're literally the most lovely humans that end up doing these things anyways. I've never met a clinician who didn't go into every single appointment I've ever witnessed with a completely open sense of, I want to do the best moral right thing for the family I'm working with today.
I agree with you, Stephanie. Being a clinician myself for 25 years, your objective, and it's so hard to get into that space and it's so hard to be in that space. You're there for the reason of help and definitely not. But there's all the implicit biases that we don't even realize that are so ingrained. And that's what you're unveiling with your research.
And how like quietly they work, right? Like how very quickly and quietly. So I can give you a quick example where a child used a rap lyric during an autism diagnosis test. You know, to the clinician, it looked like echolalia and inappropriate behavior. It could look like echolalia, right? Like legitimate, that could definitely do that, right? But in Black culture, we even have a linguistic, an academic term for this. It's called conversational sampling, which if you were in my house on Sunday night dinner with Black folks around the table, and my son didn't kind of do that type of thing where he drops a rap lyric in to be funny or a pop lyric into kind of the conversation, it would look culturally atypical, right? So that would look strange, right? So we're dealing with like tiny, tiny tensions. And you know, as a clinician, you get this many minutes to make a life-altering decision sometimes, right?
My heart is beating in response because it's so true. That language disorder, that diagnosis gets, that's captured and it's an identity.
Done. Yes. And that's the thing, right? Like that you can be a fabulous clinician. You can absolutely believe in racial equality, right? Like, and do everything for that and still come out with these outcomes that really speak differently. And that's really, really frightening, right? And it takes a lot of self-reflexivity for clinicians to be like, wow, I'm part of that process and I have to undo that. And
I'm so glad you've raised this, because I was thinking back to my days of when I was practicing, and when even the days at university, I studied at UCT and it's University of Pretoria in South Africa. And I remember, this is where I say things have changed. We were not allowed to make a diagnosis in 15 minutes. We had to see the patients for sometimes 3 sessions. That's 3 hours. We had to observe them on their own with the family dynamics, speak to the teachers. No diagnosis was made until you had a comprehensive overview of the whole child's narrative and their whole life and context and everything. And that's what's disappeared. That 3, 4, 5, and then you'd still work with him in a diagnostic process and still, okay, I think we're going in this direction, but this is the potential diagnosis, potential prognosis. And then you would do a period of experimental therapy to see, is this, that's not being done anymore. It's now, like, as you say, 15 minutes and there's your diagnosis.
Sometimes it is that quick. There's other clinics I've been in that take literal days and still have the same outcomes because we still can't untie. Language is a huge component of this. Like, I had one observation where a Black mother kept using Black language instead of code switching, and she was with the white clinician. And the white clinician, I could just tell, like, was every time the white clinician's body language would change, and she'd kind of change her positionality and have the mother in back of her instead of like facing her. And it looked to me like maybe the clinician was unused to this type of language and had some kind of aversion or some ideology about it, that it meant that the mother was less intelligent. And it was just really quite interesting because after the observation, the clinician asked what I thought, and I had written down all these really positive things about the parent. I've written, gosh, she loves this kid and she's so enamored. Every time this child did something like right during the session, the mom was like so over the moon with it, right? But she was over the moon in a way that looked very stereotypically Black language use, right? And for the clinician, that read as bad parent. Right. And I ended up kind of explain, and that's the type of thing we're talking about. Like it's just very quiet, small ways that these things are happening, but they're massive impacts.
It's
right?
insidious.
Absolutely. That's the way I describe it too. It's insidious. It's because we can't kind of untie it. And you can't, like, I can't burst into the room and be like, oh my gosh, this is happening right now. I can explain on the flip side, but no.
So in your research, I mean, I'm so glad we brought this up because it's even if this is all we discuss, just to have that concept of language, you've raised such a vitally important point. What are you proposing as a solution? Obviously, it's education based, but I don't want, what are you finding? Yeah. How do we fix this? Because we have to. I mean, it's not something that can be left there because it's just, it's a disaster.
It's a disaster area right now because we want, and I think collectively, the great majority of us do want equitable access for everybody, right? Like, I don't, that's like out of the box to say the majority of us want this to happen. But how do we get there, right? And there's a lot of like reflexivity that needs to happen on the part of clinicians too, in medical schools as well, and kind of like how we're teaching about the body without the context of the social. And that's really important. I particularly love teaching medical anthropology because I get to teach so much of the social and kind of get to like shake some brains around, right? Like, how healthcare can be perceived and understood across the globe is so different. And we need to make space to like engage with that on its terms and not just center one way of healthcare and one way of being without consideration of everybody else is engaging in health that's salient to them. And I'm hoping that medical schools are changing their social education a little bit. I'm seeing things pop up like there's, the Department for Social Medicine at UCLA now, right? In our department, there are several students getting MD PhDs. So they're becoming medical doctors, but getting the PhD in anthropology alongside. So they actually, and it's funded. If your audience doesn't know, it's a way to do medical school funded in the US.
That's brilliant. Oh, wow. If you do the MD PhD and in the anthropology, social sciences as well, that's incredible. Yeah. And that's funded. So that's good to know. Yeah, that's amazing.
Just good to know. And so useful, right? Like to be able to teach people to see the other as equitable and worth their own understanding of the world, right? Instead of just saying, must be medical, right?
Exactly. Stephanie, you say this and it makes me realize for years I've trained physicians in mental health and mind. And it's always about the I'm not an anthropologist. I am a communication pathologist and cognitive neuroscientist. So I'm looking at the context as well, but in a different way. And I have to literally teach them, you can't just look at the symptom. You have to look at the whole story behind, so it's kind of like, it's a different angle, but it's the same concept. It's just looking at the whole person, the whole environment, the whole, not just at the symptom in the body. And it's amazing how that's just, it's always shocked me that like doctors they're the first place that people will go to with mind issues or their autistic child, and they have the least experience when it comes to understanding the context. And their desire, as you said, is to help the patient. But you have to have the education. So what you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, this starts in medical school, and it starts in all the helping, all the clinical fields need to have this training as a massive part of curriculum. And those that are trained need training, need to for their continuing professional development. This needs to be it should be a core course every year. It should be a core requirement for their CPD points and things and CEUs.
Every single course that they take, it should never be like, oh, I'm in the diversity class now, right? Like it should be part and parcel of everything. How can we make this a part of an anatomy class, right? Like how can we make this part of all the pieces so that we're making these things more contextual to the lived environment, right? And you're the brightest group of folks I know. Clinicians are brilliant. Like this is definitely doable.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thing, right?
It's just a matter of
Yeah.
restructuring, isn't it? Because if you started at that level, but then if you introduced it also on the CPD level for continuing professional development, you could, and then you could have education just, yeah, I love how you say filtering it into every, well, how can you make anthropology part of anatomy? Where's the blend,
Yeah.
There's the blend
Yeah.
and that,
Yeah.
So is that where you're going with your research? Are you looking at that kind of angle as a solution potentially?
I wish I was doing solution research. I'm not. I'm still working with families. Because of COVID, we watched an entire movement take place with Black families that have children with disabilities. One of the things that's always kind of been difficult is that things like travel are really expensive. And so for us to kind of come together and have critical conversations about what Black America is going to do with disability and how we're going to love and care for these families hasn't taken place on large stages until recently. And now it's massive and it's beautiful. And these different organizations have been able to go from local work into doing national work. And so I'm listening to these advocates, these mothers of children with disabilities, kind of talk about what's meaningful to them and talk about what's meaningful to the communities. And I'm watching them teach our community kind of about disability and talking about stigma about disability within our community, and kind of trying to understand from there, how do we also intervene in this side, and what do we take from this piece to the medical side, to the education side, right? And how do we blend all of these things together? Because we have to do some real deep listening to Black families before we can also go to the medical school and be like, here's a great solution, right? So I need more time with my families to understand kind of everything that they want and need before I head back to the medical side. But I spend a lot of time with clinicians because I also love that piece, right? I think, I love being in the clinic with them. They do fabulous work. They do interesting things. They care a lot about families. So I try to make the balance, but right now I'm kind of centered these families that are doing this. It's just incredible. If you get the chance to look at it, it's just incredible, the work that's happening during COVID of all times, right?
So it's the work in actually observing families and seeing the discussions taking place.
Right. So because everything moved online, what was in-person research for me also moved online. So some of this has happened, well, actually the great majority over the last year, everything. But the blessing to this is, right, because Zoom became the normative way of communication and gathering. I watched the first Black conference on autism take place, where this mom who's just magical, she's just incredible, right? She brought together all of these Black self-advocates who have autism, Black families who are advocating for their children. She brought together Black clinicians who are thinking about autism, all into one space to communicate and be with each other and think through these things that are particular to us, right? It's just amazing. And in the face of a global pandemic that's disproportionately killing our people, in the face of the post-George Floyd world, right? You have to think about the contextualization for which these families are doing this work. I mean, it's just, she's also homeschooling her kids right now, like the rest of us, right?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Okay, we need to put that link in the show notes so people can go and watch that. And I will certainly make a point of watching that, because that's the kind of awareness. Because once you've got awareness, that generates the discussions and the ideas. And it's a massive part of change is the awareness, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yes. And I just couldn't be more thrilled to see this type of work happening, right? It's really important. It's really special to be able to be a person that gets to sit and watch it.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Wow, that's incredible. So you still defining that parameters, the asking the questions in your research and your PhD research, you're focusing a lot on the language, because you're going to need that for the educational side. Once you get there to the solutions, you know what the problems are that you can fix them. So where are you at in your research at this point?
I'm getting ready to start my field work, hopefully next fall officially. I've been doing all the preliminary work of asking questions and building relationships with folks and kind of getting to watch these events take place. And I'm really interested in not doing typical research as in viewing the families, but asking the families to work with me to ask questions that are salient to us. What is culturally salient to us, and what does it mean to be part of a research project collectively? I hope the work that I do is taken up by the families as something that they're proud of, that they feel seen and loved and respected in, right? So we can't just because I think that's also part of the project of bringing Black families together with the medical crew, right? How do we bring these two entities together is one, learning how to do research that is honoring this group of people rather than objectifying, right? So I'm hoping that that's all taking place. Hopefully I'll be done with my degree.
Well, that's amazing. And now you've mentioned about the white ideologies that are dominating autism. So that's really a big factor. And that with your research, you're hoping to change that. You're observing that and you are proposing the change. That'll lead to the proposed changes. Is that, if I understood it correctly?
Yeah, it's just as simple as like, we say white ideologies, and it doesn't mean inherently bad. I think we've gotten to a place where we say white folks are like meltdown bad. And it's not. It's just a naming of like kind of where the background is coming from. And you know about autism, you know, like Leo Kanner, and where the kind of terms came from and who kind of did the work, and then who was the first person diagnosed with autism, right? And kind of how it's structured along white understanding of what the body and normative behaviors are. And that's not atypical for medicine in general. So the thing is to like, I wouldn't argue, right? Like I have a kid with autism. He does all the autism typical behaviors, right? He has behaviors. He has, you know, some things that we could do to help him socially. He's, you know, has all kinds of stuff, right? But also making room for him to be Black and autistic, right? And making room for our family to be a Black autism loving family in ways that are culturally salient, right? Not culturally competent, but culturally salient, right? How do we keep this salient to us so that we can maintain that long-term for our family in ways that are meaningful, right? And don't force our family to like change or assimilate into things that we may not want to do, but rather to acculturate and become with one, you know, with this process. And that's a different ask. And that's a different, like potentially much different outcomes, right? And long-term outcomes. So I know people are like, oh, they're just terms, but these terms mean things.
They do mean a lot. They mean a lot. I've got two questions that I know I can just feel all the parents in my audience, because we get so many questions about autism, asking, okay, number one, what would you give us sort of some tips or guidelines for if you have an autistic child and you're Black and you have an autistic child? What are some questions you can ask or guidelines, pointers that you could give us? And then put your mom hat on and tell us maybe a bit about how you manage working mom, researching, and so like, yeah, I know those are two loaded questions, but if you can, those will be our two sort of final questions. If you could walk us through those two, that would be amazing.
Black families in the U.S. are just particularly attuned to what makes us comfortable, right? We have a long history here of knowing what it feels like to be party to microaggressions and racism and blatant racism and systemic racism. And so trust your gut. You know, if you feel like something's not okay, that's okay. Go with that. And there are lots of new emerging, like large organizations like the Color of Autism or Autism in Black that you can reach out to. You can find my email online or, you know, and so there's now some resources for folks to kind of, you know, reach out and say, okay, there's people who are experiencing this like me, right? And lean into those and allow us to like love you and support you through this process. We know it's difficult, and that's why so many of us are here doing the work.
That's wonderful. We can put that email in the show notes so they can get hold of your, so we will put that in the show notes and people can reach out to you for more specific guidance and maybe peer groups and support groups and things that they can.
People to support groups and whatnot. And because it's on Zoom, it's so much easier to get to.
Easier. I know you've got all those other factors removed. It can happen like this. Yeah.
Find parking. It's lovely. The other thing is there's a documentary coming out called In a Different Key that features my research and my family, but it also does a beautiful job talking about kind of a forward-thinking intersectional analysis of what it is to be a person with autism or love a person with autism in the US. So if you get to watch this particular documentary, it's in various locations at the moment. It's based on the book In a Different Key. So that's happening as well. If you need like an immediate kind of a way to watch something with autism that you can explore by yourself without having to encounter anybody else. Really helpful. But the mom question that's a lot. Yes, I'm a mom of a 16-year-old with autism. I have a 10-year-old who's a high ability learner, and it's a handful. It's a lot. I'm also a doctoral student, right? And that means you work a lot. And it's just a lot. It means you order meal boxes so you can not pick out the recipes, and they're usually healthy and the carrots are cut up for you, I take a lot of shortcuts where I can, center the kids. What is helpful is the kids demand attention. And so, in the evening, I try to just make that them. On the weekends, as much as possible, I try to make that them, and because otherwise, I don't know, I'm a professional nerd, right? I'm a PhD student. So I love to read and I like to do my work. And so I can get really carried away.
Really with it. I relate totally to that. Yeah.
You
get immersed and yeah.
So sometimes it is like the kid movie and pizza night and mom's nose in the book while we're all on the couch. But that's, we're all together.
You together, that's the thing. And not to feel guilty about that, because you need your PhD, your work that you're doing is very sad. It's strengthening you to be able to meet the needs of your children. So that's I think that's why so many moms feel they have to sacrifice themselves to the point where they don't do anything that stimulates them. But that I know for me, being a working mom, doing my PhD when my 4 kids were young, that kind of thing, it made me a better mother because I was very satisfied in myself. I don't know if that's what you're saying, if I'm hearing you say that. So
absolutely. I have to have adult conversation, and I need to have conversations that, are stimulating and are academically stimulating. And and I think being a mother, this is really important, and you can do both. I think we're told that we can't, or you'll be terrible at one. I mean, maybe the laundry piles up, but girl, that's a small price to pay to be able to and also having a little girl who's a high ability learner watch her mom make it through a PhD program. My little girl just has access. She goes to class with me at times at UCLA when I teach and when I take class. She's sat in classrooms with really brilliant professors, and none of this will be news to her when she gets there, right? She knows this possibility for her, which is part of breaking down disparities, is just teaching Black kids that this is possible. You belong, right? And that is for her part of the process, right? So I don't. Maybe she might be different in 10 years. I don't know, but that's what I think of her.
Well, I take off my hat to you. I take off my hat to you in so many ways, being a mom with a child with autism, working, doing a PhD, and so good that you've immersed yourself in the love of your work and that you are contributing to society. And you're showing that it can be done. It's not easy, but it can be done. And I'm sure you're a lot happier because you are doing this great work, which your child is going to be, both your kids are benefiting from in different ways. And you're laying a groundwork for the future. So I just wanted to, really thank you for the work you're doing, and it's incredible. And thank you for sharing. And you've given us so many, because there's a documentary, there's a great blog that you've written. I was reading that; it's phenomenal. There's what else? What other things? Just in closing, how else can people get hold of you? So it's your email. There's the documentary. Yes. What else? I
have a website that really just is. I mean, it's not very active, but it's alive, and so. Find me via my website, which is stephaniekeeneyparks.com. Right now, the documentary is floating around. You can find it at various film festivals, and you can look at In a Different Key, the movie, and you can see the trailer for that. And that gives you a little bit of context for the work I do, but also importantly, various ways of encountering autism across this nation. It's really quite a beautiful documentary. And then there's the small blog that I've written. I've written several chapters in the last year they're all buried in academic books. So I don't know when they will show up on Earth, which is part of the process of academic publishing. So, it's a tough go right now with that.
It is very tough going out there, but I think you've given people a very good place to start. And, it's the start that people can then reach back out to. And as the community builds, that's when things start happening. So thank you so much for your work, and thank you so much for your time. And it's been an honor meeting you and an honor talking to you. And I'm very inspired and very excited about what you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leaf.